Hello, I'm Chad Welch, and welcome to Helpful Conversations. We begin a new video series. This series discussing the nation of Israel and God's plans for the nation of Israel. In this particular video, I'd like to discuss Romans 9, 10, and 11, which I find to be in the New Testament one of the clearest passages in support of the future, God's future plans for the nation of Israel and his plans for the future blessing of the Jewish people. And so we want to explore that in this particular video. Please, as you're watching these videos, keep your comments and the discussion to the particular video at hand. There's a lot that can be brought into these discussions. But this particular video, we're looking at Romans 9, 10, and 11, and we want to keep the discussions on those verses. We'll look at others at another time. All right, as we look at Romans 9, 10, and 11, my question is this. When in Romans 9 through 11 does Paul expand his definition of Israel to include the Gentiles? Now, I am not going to contend that there's never a time when the concept of seed of Abraham is used spiritually in a sense to include the Gentiles. I think we do see that. We clearly see that in Galatians chapter 3, that Gentiles are called the seed of Abraham in that they follow in his faith. And so it is possible at times for certain terms to be used in a figurative sense. But as we examine Romans 9, 10, and 11, when do we ever get a clear indication that Paul is using anything other than the straightforward definition he begins with in the book of Romans? And so as Paul begins Romans in chapter 9, verses 1 through 5, as he begins this section, he clearly defines for us in those first 5 verses who he's talking about. He speaks of these individuals as his brother, his countrymen, according to the flesh. They are the Israelites, and he clearly defines these people as the Jewish people by birth, the Israelites. As Paul continues in Romans 9, 10, and 11, he continues to distinguish between Jews and Gentiles before and after the infamous statement, they are not all Israel who are of Israel. And we'll talk a little bit more extensively about that statement later on in the passage. But he clearly indicates as he continues that when he uses the term Israel, he is still talking specifically about the Jewish people. And so he says this in Romans 9, verse 6, but it is not that the word of God has taken none effect, for they are not all Israel who are of Israel. And so he says that, and he goes on to describe that. And again, we'll talk further about that later on. But I just want you to notice that afterwards, Paul clearly is talking about Israel, and when he uses the term Israel, he is talking about the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He's talking about natural-born Israelites. And so in verse 24 of chapter 9, even us whom he called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. And so he talks about the calling, and he mentions that he calls Gentiles, but he also calls Jews. He says there are Jews and there are Gentiles that have been called. You go down to verse 30, and he says this, what shall we then say? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, even to the righteousness of faith, but Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness. And so, again, clearly using the term Israel to talk about the descendants of Jacob, those that are natural-born Israelites. In fact, obviously not people that are part of the church. And so Israel continues to be used of those that are descendants of Jacob. As he heads into chapter 10, Paul desires for Israel to be saved. This parallels the beginning of chapter 9, where he talks about his conscience and his sorrow and his heaviness of heart for his brother according to the flesh. And now he says that his desire for them and his prayer for them is that they might be saved. So when he talks about Israel and his desire for them to be saved, he is clearly once again talking about Jewish people that are unsaved. And he doesn't change the definition. Israel is not the church. Israel is not believers, Jews and Gentiles. Israel is unsaved, or saved and unsaved Jews, with an emphasis here on the unsaved ones. In Romans 10:14 through 21, Paul is still talking about ethnic Israel. And Israel is described consistently as those that are disobedient, those that have rebelled, and those that have rejected God. In verse 19, but I say, did Israel not know? Romans 10:19, did Israel not know? First Moses say, I will provoke you to jealousy, you Israel, to jealousy by those who are not a nation, the Gentiles. I will move you to anger, you Israel, to anger by a foolish nation. But Isaiah is very bold and says, I was found by those who did not seek after me, the Gentiles, and was manifest to those who did not ask after me, again, Gentiles. Verse 21, but to Israel, he says, making a distinction between the Gentiles who have believed him, making a distinction between those that found him, though they did not seek after him. And now he defines Israel, and he's clearly talking about unsaved, unbelieving Israel when he says this in verse 21, all the day long I have stretched out my hand to a disobedient and contrary people. And so as he continues to clearly use Israel, not only of descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, but of those that are unbelieving, of the nation as a whole that have been disobedient to him, making a clear distinction between them and the Gentiles that have found them. And nowhere does he indicate that the church is Israel. Israel is the church. And so he continues to use this definition of Israel that he defined for us in those first 5 verses, and he never moves away from that definition. All right, as we continue then into chapter 11, it is clear again that Paul has not changed his definition of Israel from where he started. It says this in verse 1 of chapter 11. For I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. It makes no sense if you try and make his people there the church. Has God cast away his church? That doesn't make any sense. He's talking about the Jewish people. He's just talked about the Jewish people rejection of God and God's therefore turning away from them. But then he asks the question, has God cast away his people? And the obvious answer is no. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. He makes it very clear that when he mentions Israel and the fact that God has not cast away his people, that he is talking about Israel as a people group, as the descendants of Abraham. And there he even mentions the tribe of Benjamin to be even more specific. Paul suggests that the answer to the question, has God cast away his people, is no. And by the way, in that verse, he calls the Jews, Israel, his people. Very interesting. Then as we continue, in verse 2, he says the same thing. Has God cast away his people whom he foreknew? A reference to the Jewish people. Or do you not know what the scriptures say? Elijah, how he pleaded with God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I alone am left. They seek my life. And what does the divine response say to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And so Paul, in discussing his people, the people that God foreknew, brings up Elijah. And Elijah, when he felt like he was all alone within the Jewish people, and God says, no, I've reserved for myself 7,000. And so it's clear, once again, that when God says his people, who he foreknew, and as Paul answers that question, has God cast away his people, who he foreknew, he's talking about the Jewish people, Israel, because he brings up the story of Elijah. and what happened with Elijah. Again, when does the definition of Israel in these 3 chapters change from that beginning statement as Paul defines who he's talking about? All right. As we continue here, looking at the definition and Paul's use of the word Israel and Jewish people within Romans 9, 10, and 11, and asking the question, when exactly does he clearly change the definition so that Israel is the church, or Israel is believers, versus the natural descendants of Abraham? We notice that in Romans chapter 11, both before and after the tree illustration, Israel continues to be the natural descendants of Jacob. And so we read in Romans chapter 11, verses 11 through 14. I say then, have they stumbled? Has the church stumbled that they should fall? No. Has Israel stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. But through their fall, through the church's fall? No, through Israel's fall, through the Jews' fall, to provoke them to jealousy, to provoke Israel to jealousy, not the church to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. So Gentiles are being saved for the purpose of provoking the Jews who fell to jealousy. Now, if their fall, the church's fall? No, if Israel's fall is the riches of the world and their failure, who, the church's failure? No, Israel's failure, the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? And he continues, you can read that for yourself. He continues to use the definition and the idea of Israel. He's talking about the descendants of Jacob. He's talking about the natural born descendants of Jacob. And then as we pick it up in verse 25, after the tree illustration, which is given as definitive proof that Gentiles are now Israel and that the church is Israel, and it's given to us as this defining proof, we read the verses afterwards and we see that Paul is still using the term Israel of the Jewish people. He says this, for I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinions, that blindness in part has happened to Israel. Blindness in part has happened to the church? Blindness in part has happened to the church. Does that make sense? No, blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved, as it is written. The deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant with them, when I will take away their sins. Concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. If he's talking about the church, and he has changed definitions of Israel to be the church, and the church is Israel, this verse makes no sense. Concerning the gospel, the church is enemies for your sake? But concerning election, the church is beloved for the sake of the fathers. He's talking both, verse 28, the first phrase and the second phrase in that verse are talking about the same group of people. And the first phrase says that they are enemies. Who are enemies? Well, he's told us. God has turned away from working with Israel. He's turned away from working with the Jewish people in mass and has turned unto the Gentiles so that more Gentiles are being saved than are Jews. So they are the enemies. And again, it makes no sense if you think the enemies are the church. But concerning election, they are beloved for the Father's sake. And that fathers is plural, talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. They are beloved for the Father's sake. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. The gifts and the calling of God that he gave to the fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the reason that they are still beloved and the reason that the blindness has happened in part for a time until the fullness of the Gentiles has come is because, but that they're going to be brought back and grafted back in again is because the promises that God made to the fathers are irrevocable. He continues to talk about the Jewish people, and he has not changed definitions. Those are not verses about the church. They cannot be verses about the church. When Paul speaks of Israel, he talks and uses words like my covenant in verse 27. Verse 28, he talks about election. He talks about being beloved. He talks about the gifts that God has given and the calling of God that are given. Paul ends Romans 11 using the same definition of Israel and Jews, which he used from the very beginning. And it doesn't change after he talks about they're not all Israel which are of Israel. He continues to consistently use the same definition and concept of Israel. And it doesn't change after he uses the tree illustration. He continues to use the same definition of Israel. And so my question is, when does this definition change? All right, so in our analysis of Romans 9, 10, and 11, the next thing we want to do is see the words that Paul clearly uses concerning the Jewish people, Israel, the natural descendants of Jacob in Romans 9, 10, and 11, in verses that are clearly talking about Israel. So in Romans 9, 1 through 5, he calls them his brethren. He calls them his countrymen according to the flesh. He calls them Israelites. And so laying out a clear definition of who he's talking about. So we know he's talking about those that are his countrymen according to the flesh, that are his brethren in a nationality sense. We know that and then he defines them as Israelites. Then he says that what pertains to those that are his countrymen according to the flesh. The adoption pertains to them. Glory pertains to them. The covenants pertain to them. The giving of the law pertains to them. The service, the ministry of God, all the temple worship, that pertains to them. The promises pertain to them. Christ as their countryman is a truth and a reality there, again, helping us understand who they are. But he begins with all of these things about the Jewish people, the physical descendants of Jacob, and helping us understand some things about them. As we continue to look at Paul's identification of Israel in verses which must refer to the physical descendants of Jacob, we see some more things that are very interesting in this discussion. Because some people get offended when you say that the Jews are God's people. The Jews are God's people. They say, no, you can't say the Jews are God's people. Well, notice what is said here in Hebrews, Romans 11, verse 1. I say then, has God cast away his people? No. Okay. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, there's no doubt what he's talking about here. He is talking about the physical descendants of Jacob, and whether or not God is completely and totally and absolutely done with the physical descendants of Jacob. And in asking the question whether or not God is done with the physical descendants of Jacob, and his answer makes it clear he's talking about the physical descendants of Jacob, Paul says his people, God's people, the people that belong to God. These are the words of Scripture that Paul is using as he is talking about these things. Then he goes on in verse 11 and doubles down on his statement. God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew. Okay, again, clearly talking about Israelites based off of verse 11 and the things leading up to it. And this time, once again, for a second time, he calls them his people, God's people. And then he says, whom he foreknew, and uses that language of foreknowledge, predestination, the idea of chosen. Again, people get upset if you say Israel. Jews are God's people, God's special people, God's chosen people, which doesn't mean exactly what a lot of people try and make it mean. But here, once again, they are referred to as his people whom he foreknew. As you continue, you get into the illustration of the tree, and we'll discuss that a little later on. Right now, we're just looking at the words that Paul uses concerning the Jewish people to get a sense of the Jews, of Israelites, of Paul's understanding concerning the Jewish people. And in chapter 11, verse 21, he calls them the natural branches. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. All right, and we understand the tree illustration, but the idea here is that the Jews, even the ones that have been cast away, even the ones that have been cut off, he calls them the natural branches. So they are his people. They are his people whom he foreknew. They are the natural branches. Having been cut off, they are still the natural branches. Verse 28, they are beloved. Romans 11, verse 28, concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but concerning the election, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the sake of the promises that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they continue and are beloved. They are the natural branches. They are his people that he foreknew, and they are beloved. In verse 29, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Still calling, or still talking about the ones that are the enemies for your sake, which again cannot be talking about the church. They are enemies for your sake, but they are beloved. And why are they beloved? Because the gifts and the calling are irrevocable. The calling of God that he gave to the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the promises that he gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they cannot be revoked. And so because of the fathers and the calling and the promises that God gave to the fathers, they are still beloved. And so these are the things that Paul says in verses that clearly reference the Jewish people. And in verses that make no sense if you make them about the Gentiles, if you make them about the church in general. Again, what sense does it make if you make verse 28 about the church? Concerning the gospel, the church is enemies for your sake. So again, clearly talking about the Jewish people, and these are the things that are said about them. Now, my question has been, when does Paul begin to use a different definition of Israel other than the descendants of Abraham? I think I've clearly shown where there is a consistency throughout Romans 9, 10, and 11 using the term Israel of the physical descendants of Abraham. But some are going to point to Romans chapter 9, verse 6, and say, well, the redefinition is almost immediate. Even though Paul, after he says what he says in Romans chapter 9, verse 6, continues to use the term Israel for the descendants of Abraham, they're still going to say this is a place where Paul redefines Israel as something bigger than just the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But there's two different theories concerning Romans chapter 9, verse 6, which Romans chapter 9, verse 6 says this, but it is not that the word of God has taken none effect, for they are not all Israel who are of Israel. And so clearly in that verse, there are two different meanings of Israel. If Israel is not Israel, and there's a situation where Israel is not Israel, then there's two different definitions of Israel in that verse. And so that's clear. And so there is one theory that says that indicates an expansion of the meaning in the term Israel. So Israel originally meant the descendants of Jacob. Jacob was renamed Israel, and that name Israel of the father Jacob became the name of the nation, and the descendants of Jacob therefore are Israel. And so that is the one meaning of Israel. But then there is the belief that God expands the definition of Israel to include the Gentiles that are saved. And so that Israel becomes the church, and the meaning of Israel is the church. And so they would say in that verse, they are not all Israel who are of Israel, and that there's two, the one is descendants of Israel, and the other is Israel and the church, and there's an expansion of that definition. The other understanding is that there is a narrowing of the word Israel, that the two Israels are the descendants of Israel and those that are the remnant who are the believing descendants of Israel. And so the question is, when Paul says, for they are not all Israel who are of Israel, is he expanding the definition and the idea of Israel to say that, well, not everybody who is an Israelite is part of the church, and the church is Israel? And so you've got this expansion. Or is he saying that not everybody who is a descendant of Abraham is a spiritual descendant of Abraham by faith? And so is it an expansion, or is it a narrowing of the idea of Israel? So that the first one means the nation, the descendants of Abraham, and the second one means the believing remnant of Abraham's descendants, or of Jacob's descendants. And so that's the question before us, and we need to look, what does the passage seem to indicate? Does the passage seem to indicate an expansion of the word Israel to include Gentiles and all believers throughout history? Or is it seem to indicate a narrowing of the word Israel so that it is talking about the believing descendants of Israel? They are the true Israel because they are the true spiritual children of Abraham in this passage. So the question before us is that about they are not all Israel which are of Israel. Is that second Israel an expansion of the idea of Israel, or a narrowing? So that it's defining anybody who ever believes in Jesus and anybody that's ever had faith towards God as Israel and the church? Or is it narrowing it to speak of a remnant? And as we head through the chapter, you will see that every illustration that is used of a narrowing of the definition, not an expansion. In the very next verse, he's just said they're not all Israel which are of Israel. Verse 7, nor are they all children, because they are the seed of Abraham, but in Isaac your seed shall be called. And so he's just said, you know, they're all descendants of Israel, but they're not necessarily Israel. And there are many that are descendants of Abraham, but they are also not Israel. They're not called. Abraham had other children, Ishmael, and then others after that with his wife Keturah, if I got her name right. But he had other children. But those that were called are not the big, expansive number of Abraham's children from all of his seed, but it's only through Isaac. And so that is a narrowing of the definition. That is a narrowing of the seed of Abraham from the expansive, all of his descendants, to the narrowing of just Isaac. And then he goes from Isaac to talk about Isaac's children, Jacob and Esau, and narrows it further. That is, those who are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God. So not everybody that is a child of Abraham or a descendant of Abraham by the flesh are the children of God. But the children of the promise are counted as seed. And who's the promise? The promise is through Isaac. He's just told us this. It's not all the physical descendants of Abraham. It's the ones that are from the child of promise, which is Isaac. Then he goes on, verse 9, for this is the word of promise that at this time I will come and Sarah will have a son. So again, he continues to define what he's talking about. He's not expanding the term, the seed of Abraham to all believers throughout all time. And I know he does in Galatians chapter 3. Okay, so Galatians chapter 3, he talks about all of us as spiritual seed of Abraham. I get that. But in this passage, that's not what he's saying. In this passage, he is narrowing it. In this passage, he is saying not all the descendants of Abraham, but Isaac, and only the descendants of Isaac. He continues, not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one, even our father Isaac, before the children not yet being born, nor having done any good or evil, that the purposes of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him who calls, it was said to her, the older shall serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau have I hated. And so again, we have a further narrowing. You have all the descendants of Abraham, but it was just Isaac that was the child of promise and to whom the promises were passed on to. And then Rebekah had two sons, Esau and Jacob. And the promises were narrowed down so that it's not all of the descendants of Isaac, but it is simply the passed on to Jacob. And so we continue to have this concept of a narrowing. And so not everybody that is born in a descendant of Jacob is the true spiritual descendants of Jacob. So Isaac was the true spiritual and physical descendant of Abraham. Jacob was the true physical and spiritual descendant of Isaac. And then it continues, and in the next few verses, it talks about a remnant. And so as he continues here in the chapter, he talks about the fact that God has always promised a remnant. And so he ends with a quote here and a couple passages of scripture that are talking about the fact that God preserves a remnant of Jewish people. And he will always preserve a remnant of Jewish people, which again, a remnant is a part of the whole. Isaac is a remnant of Abraham's seed. It's not all of Abraham's seed, it's a remnant. Jacob is a remnant of Isaac's seed. And then the true Israel is and faithful Israel and believing Israel is a remnant of the seed of Israel, or the seed of Jacob. And so that's what he talks about there in verse 27. Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel, concerning the Jewish people. Again, and this is going to have to be, as you look at the prophecy, this cannot be about the church. Okay? Though the number of Israel be as the sand of the sea, a remnant shall be saved. If it's about the church, though the number of the church shall be as the sand of the sea, a remnant will be saved? A part of them will be saved? No, this is about Israel and the promises that God made to Israel. And it is again a narrowing of the concept of Israel as he speaks about a remnant. And again, we don't have to guess on this, because later on, Paul in chapter 11 is going to talk about what he means about a remnant of Israel. And it's not the church, it's the Jewish people. And so everything we've seen so far is a narrowing. There are all these descendants of Israel, but only some of them are true physical and spiritual descendants of Israel. Isaac is a remnant of the seed of Abraham. Jacob is a remnant of the seed of Isaac. And then the true Israel is a remnant of the seed of Isaac, or of Israel. And then, so then we jump over to Romans chapter 11, and this concept continues. I say then, has God cast away his people? Again, doesn't make any sense if it's talking about the church. Has God cast away his church? No, it's talking about the Jewish people. He's just talked about the God's discipline of the Jewish people and how he stretched forth his hand to them constantly. Paul is going to say that he clearly defined that he's talking about the Israelites. And he says this, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. And so Paul becomes a remnant of the seed of Jacob. He becomes a remnant of the nation of Israel that is still saved, indicating that God has not cast away his people. Again, that term used of the Jewish people, and Paul indicating that, yeah, there's still a remnant. So once again, we have this narrowing. Not all of Israel, not all of the Jewish people that are descendants of Jacob are saved, but there is an Israel within Israel. There's a spiritual Israel within the descendants of Israel that follow not only that are not only physical descendants but also spiritual descendants, and Paul is one of them. And then Paul talks about the remnant of 7,000 Jews in the days of Elijah. Again, continuing to show and indicate God's intentions for his people and for there always to be a remnant. And so he says this in verse 4 of Romans chapter 11. But what does the divine response say? I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. All right, talking about Israel, talking about God's choosing of them and that they are his people who he foreknew. And there is a remnant, and there will always be a remnant of the Jewish people that are saved, that are believers. And then you get down in verse 5. Even so, at this present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. Okay, that remnant is in the context of Jewish people, in the context of descendants, physical descendants of Abraham. And so as we ask ourselves, what does Paul mean when he says that they're not all Israel, which are of Israel? Is he expanding the term Israel? Do we have any reason whatsoever at all in Romans 9, 10, and 11 to expand the definition of Israel to mean the church and to all the believers and all those that have faith in God throughout history? Or do we have a clear narrowing of the definition to a remnant? And again, the examples Paul clearly gives immediately following the statement indicate a narrowing. It's not all of Abraham's children, it's those that came through Isaac. It's not all of Isaac's children, it's those that came from Jacob. It's not all of Jacob's children, but it's a remnant. And of course, then when we come to that statement, so all Israel shall be saved, I believe, and I would understand that's where he brings into play that second definition of Israel. They're not all Israel, which are of Israel. There is that sense in which there are Jews that are both physical descendants and spiritual descendants. And I do believe that in the last days that there will be a higher degree and there will be a mass turning of Jews to Christ, so that remnant is a large group. But nonetheless, I think he brings in that second definition. So there are two definitions of Israel, but I think it's pretty clear that there is a narrowing of that definition, not an expansion of it in Romans 9, 10, and 11. All right, so now we come to the tree illustration in Romans chapter 11. And I find it interesting in Romans chapter 11 with the tree illustration that the tree is used to prove things that are not explicitly stated. The tree is never stated to be Israel. And it is never stated that the implications of the tree illustration is that the Gentiles that believe are now Israel. And that the Gentiles, the church in Israel are one, and all kinds of implications based off of the tree illustration. Paul has just said that God is not going to work with the Jewish people as much because of their stubborn heart of unbelief, that he is going to begin to work with the Gentile people at a much higher level than he has in the past. And so that there is going to be this transitioning from a focus on the Jewish people to a focus on the Gentiles, and that the Gentiles are going to begin to participate in the promises through Abraham that were meant for them. And by the way, it's no big surprise to dispensationalists. It's no big surprise to those that believe in a future for Israel that the Gentiles are going to participate in the blessings and promises. Okay? That was made clear in Genesis chapter 12. That through Abraham all nations of the world will be blessed. Repeatedly throughout the prophecies, that there is an indication that the Gentiles are going to participate at some level in the promises and in the blessings of Abraham. So it's no big surprise, and there's no contradiction or problems with our understanding of prophecy to know that the Gentiles are going to be blessed through Abraham and blessed through the promises that God made to Abraham. And so that's not a problem for us, and that's not a problem for those that understand these passages this way. But what is never stated is that this tree is Israel, and that the Gentiles have become Israel, and that believing Gentiles have become Israel, and that the church and Israel are all one. That this is not stated. What is stated is very clear, that the Jews are the natural branches. That the Jews, who are earlier called his people in verse 1 of chapter 11 and in verse 2 of chapter 11, are cut off. But the ones that are cut off are still called the natural branches. They are still referred to as the branches, the natural branches. And the implication of Paul is that the Gentiles, who are not the natural branches, should not be lifted up with pride against those that are the natural branches. And again, in this passage, the natural branches that we are not to be lifted up with pride against are the branches that have been cut off, the unbelieving Jews. The warning there in verse 17 is about being lifted up with pride and boasting against, no, I'm sorry, verse 18. And do not boast against the branches. But if you boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. And so the branches, the Jewish people, are called the natural branches. And he is reminding us that we as Gentiles are being grafted into the promises that were made to them, and that they are still the natural branches. And that we need to always remember that they are the natural branches. And we should never become proud and arrogant and boastful against the natural branches, which, by the way, the natural branches are the ones that are cut off. This is not just believing Jews. This is unbelieving Jews. This is not talking about within the church and among believers. This is talking about believing Gentiles' attitude towards the Jewish people. The natural branches, and he says, don't ever become arrogant and boastful against the natural branches. And he goes on to explain to us why some of these things, because God intends to drive ungodliness out of Jacob, that though they are enemies for your sake, they are still beloved, because the gifts and the callings of God are without repentance. And so, again, as we look at Romans chapter 11 and the tree illustration, with everything that people want to make the tree mean, as far as whether or not Israel is the church and the church is Israel, and there's one people of God throughout all history, and it's, we shouldn't be calling the present day Jews God's people, even though Romans chapter 11 twice calls Israel, Jewish people, his people, and Romans chapter 11 says that they are the natural branches. The main point that Paul makes is that the Jewish people, saved or unsaved, are the natural branches. And Gentiles who are believers should not be lifted up with pride against the natural branches. And again, this is the main point of the illustration, regardless of what else people can try and make it say. And so I think we do well to understand that illustration, to look at it in context, not bring a bunch to the text, but simply look at the implications that Paul himself makes from the text. And in all of that, he never redefines the definition of the word Israel that he is using. He never changes it. He never uses Israel in any way other than the clearly referring to the descendants of Jacob. All right, as Paul closes out Romans 9, 10, and 11, it is quite abundantly clear that Paul is not using Israel as Israel/church, all God's people throughout all time, or all believers throughout all time, but he's simply referencing the descendants of Jacob. And primarily, in fact, in this context, he's referencing unbelieving descendants of Jacob as Israel. And so he says this starting in verse 24, for if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into the cultivated olive tree. Okay, so you, the Gentiles, were brought into the olive tree. How much more will these, the Jews, who are by nature, who are natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Again, that's talking about unbelieving Jews and the Jewish people in general who have been cut off, who God is not working with as much right now as he has in the past. He says, but how much more if they are the natural branches that they will be grafted back in? So he's clearly talking about the descendants of Israel, those that call themselves Israel by nature. For I do not, verse 25, for I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinions, that blindness in part has happened to the church. No, blindness in part has happened to Israel. He's just talked about in verse 24, blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. He talks about the time of the Gentiles. We're in the time of the Gentiles. God's not working with Israel as much as he used to in the past. He's focused on the Gentiles for a time. But he doesn't want us to be ignorant of a mystery, that there's a time of partial blindness. Verse 26, and so all Israel will be saved. All right, we don't have time maybe to get into that. I do believe there's coming a day when God will bring judgment, and everybody who's alive on that day will be believers. And so there will be a day when all Israel is saved. It's not that all Jewish people, every single Jewish people, come to repentance, but they will either have gone through earthly judgment and died, or they will be believers in Jesus Christ. But I also think that this passage indicates a widespread return of the Jewish people to Christ in the final days. And that's what is stated here. The deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. Remember, this is all in the context of not boasting against the natural branches. It's in the context of God expressing his purposes for the natural branches. It is in the context of us not being ignorant concerning Israel, the natural branches, and those that blindness has been come in part to. Israel, again, not the church. Blindness in part has happened to Israel. It continues there, for this is my covenant with them, those that currently are blinded in part, the nation of Israel, for I will take away their sins. Concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. Again, cannot be talking about the church. He's not changed his definition of Israel in one way from what he started at. But concerning the election, those that are enemies for your sake, for the Gentiles' sake, those that God has turned away from for a time so that he can focus on the Gentiles, They are enemies for your sake. But concerning the election, they are beloved for the Father's sake, for the sake of the fathers. Because of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they remain in a condition, in a place where they are beloved. For the gifts and the callings of God are irrevocable. And again, that fathers at the end of verse 28 is talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it says that the reason that those that are the enemies, those that God has turned away from, the Jewish people, those that God has cut off out of the tree currently, the reason that they have a future, and the reason that they will be grafted back in, and the reason that Christ will come and drive ungodliness out of Jacob, is because of the promises, that the gifts, the blessings, and the calling that God gave to the fathers are irrevocable. He made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He will fulfill those promises, and therefore the Jewish people who are now hated are still beloved. Again, it makes no sense to understand it any other way. I don't know how you come to these verses and take any other interpretation or understanding than that. For as you were once disobedient, you Gentiles, as you were once disobedient to God, yet now have obtained mercy through their disobedience, through Israel's disobedience. You were grafted in and they were taken out. He's discussed these things since the beginning of Romans chapter 11. Even so, these, the Jewish people, those that are enemies for the sake of Christ, but are beloved because of the fathers, even these, the Jews, also have now been disobedient, that they, through mercy shown to you, they also may obtain mercy. For God has committed them all to disobedience, that he might have mercy on all. Oh, the depth and the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his ways and his judgments past finding out. Those verses make no sense if Paul has changed the definition of Israel. And now Israel is the church. Israel is all believers throughout history in this one organization called Israel/Church. No, that doesn't compute with what is being said. So the tree illustration, again, does not change the definition of Israel that Paul is using. And there's no place in Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11 where the definition of Israel is changed. And so anyway, these are my thoughts, my challenges to you as we look at Romans 9, 10, and 11. Again, please keep your comments to Romans 9, 10, and 11. I know there's other things that come into this discussion, but let's keep the discussion on this video to these particular matters and discussing Romans 9, 10, and 11. Thanks.